Just a brief word about this last part of the event. It's the third annual C. Boyden Gray Lecture on the Administrative State. Even though we'd already named the center after Boyden, or Boyden had lent his name to the center, a few years ago we decided we wanted to have an annual lecture that touches on the intersection of ideas and public service. Again, in the spirit of Boyden, who I gotta say loved the event, and he was at the first two installments. Our first C. Boyden Gray lecture was Justice Neil Gorsuch discussing his book, A Republic If You Can Keep It. And then the second last spring, was former Labor Secretary Gene Scalia giving reflections on what he learned about the rule of law while leading an agency, the Labor Department. And so as we thought about who to invite to give the third C. Boyden Gray lecture, and we knew that we'd combine it with today's event, so we knew we'd be thinking a lot about Boyden, we thought who better to invite than Don McGahn. As we've been discussing all day today, Boyden cared about public service, he cared about judges, he cared about good regulatory reform. And Don McGahn, recently White House counsel, embodies that spirit maybe better than anybody in Washington. As many of you know, Don McGahn served as White House counsel from 2017 to 2018, where he really focused, like Boyden, on judicial appointments and regulatory reform and the rule of law. Before coming to the White House, he was a commissioner of the FEC and its chairman for a year. He was chief counsel of the Republican National Committee from, Don, help me out here.
Long time.
For a long time. He's now a partner at Jones Day, where he co-leads their Department on Government Regulation. Don, we're so glad you could join us today, and we've been looking forward to your remarks. Please join me in welcoming Don McGahn.
Thank you, Adam, for the kind introduction. It's very humbling to be here for a lot of reasons, but sort of be the keynote at something named after Boyden is really amazing. I have prepared remarks, and I always do improv ahead of time, but I want to sort of beg your indulgence because so much of what I tried to be was based upon Boyden, for better or for worse. So it's all his fault, I suppose. I remember the first time I met Boyden. I had just moved to D.C. It was a Federalist Society, the National Lawyers Convention, and I had missed his speech. I wanted to see his speech, but I had to run back to the firm and do client things. I was an associate, and I came back, and he's standing there talking to some people, and I don't remember who he was talking to, but I knew one of the people, sort of. So I said, here's my chance. So I went up to the group, and there's Boyden, and I said, hi, I really liked your speech. And most of the time, people, oh, thank you, and they would keep talking. Nope, I got, oh, what did you like about it? Now, having not been there, I was in trouble. So I said, well, I really liked your theme, how it kind of went through the whole speech in the end, really tied back to the beginning. And Boyden just looked at me and said, and I just said, I'm going to stand over there now. So that was my first encounter with Boyden. It only went uphill from there. So later on, I got to know Boyden quite well, and he spent quite a bit of time with me when I was named White House counsel. And in my sort of dream scenario, I had two legal heroes. One was Ed Meese, still is, and the other was Boyden Gray. And when I came to the White House, sometimes I call it my happy place. Somebody gets the joke, thank you. I really tried to copy Boyden. So everything I'm going to say here today really is kind of a ripoff of what Boyden started, and I tried to humbly finish. Now, really because we had the same job, I certainly realized that Boyden's kind of like the Beatles and I'm kind of like the Monkees. So I'm sort of a slapstick parody of the good stuff. But Boyden was very helpful along the way. And I have two vivid memories of Boyden. I was in the White House and he was there for lunch with Mark Paoletta. Mark loved to invite people to lunch before I did. So Boyden was there getting ready to eat, sitting outside the Navy mess, and I saw him, and he said, "Hey, how's it going?" And I would call him every so often. In transition, we spent a lot of time together, kind of getting a sense of how to do the job. And he said, don't worry, you're doing fine. And those who remember the early days of the Trump administration know they were not the smoothest waters. And he said, you're doing fine. You're getting the hang of it. It's going to be fine. And I said, you think so? He said, Don, I was counsel to the vice president for 8 years. When I became counsel to the president, it was an entirely different job. There were so many things I didn't know, and I had been walking around the White House for 8 years. And unless you've actually had the job, you have no idea what you're talking about. You're doing fine. And, you know, I didn't quit that day. So that was a good thing. And the second memory is very sad. It's the last time I saw Boyden, and it was at the Four Seasons in the Health Club. I don't recall why I was there, but I was in the locker room. And Boyden comes in from the steam room or whatever, and hey, Boyden. And, oh, Don. So that was the last time we spoke. And there's a special bond between men when the last time you sort of talk to each other, when you're sort of in robes and, you know, not wearing socks. So I've just tried to copy so much of what he tried to do, and I'm going to cover some of that in my prepared remarks. But again, it's really an honor, and Adam, thanks for inviting me, and thanks to the school, and thanks for everyone here listening. I guess I have a third memory of Boyden. I was at a firm that was kind of diagonal across the street from Wilmer Cutler Pickering, and when I was a young associate, a friend of mine was another associate, and he had worked for Boyden in the White House. And we would usually have meetings in the afternoon in his office. That's what we called them, meetings. And we would see Boyden sort of walking home. And I thought that was the coolest thing. This guy was White House counsel and he's already leaving the firm. That's the life I want. Later, when I pieced it together, he was walking home every day like clockwork to see his daughter. Every day. And I thought, you know, that's the kind of guy I want to be. I can't stay for the reception. I have to run and take my kids to a hockey game tomorrow. So living the dream. So turning to the substance, I'd like to kind of discuss where I think we are today while the ink of Loper Bright is still drying. A lot of media coverage of it. If you read the newspapers and listen to the TV commentators in the lead up to this June, you might have mistaken that administrative law and Chevron deference have been a long-time centerpiece of the entire conservative legal movement. That's simply not true. In reality, the legal orthodoxy, even for most conservatives, had built up around deference doctrine, Chevron and otherwise, under the notion that deference was a version of judicial restraint. And it was echoed through most of corporate America, the academy, think tanks, trade associations, Congress, and really on both sides of the aisle. There were a handful of folks, though, who saw it differently. Boyden was obviously one of them. But when I read articles that make it sound like everybody thought this was the way to go, that's not right. It's simply not right. He was a pioneer and remains one. Let's take a step back to around 2016, the tail end of the Obama administration. Administrative law was not the driving force in the national conversation has become today. Sure, there were some people talking about it, Boyden at his law firm. Certainly folks in this room, at least some. A few professors scattered around the country and a judge here or there waxing about the finer details, maybe sometimes in a concurrence out in Colorado. But that was being sort of dismissed as sort of idiosyncratic musings. The conversation had not entered the larger political consciousness, let alone become the topic du jour for years, running among corporate councils, think tanks, and the media. So how do we get where we are today? Well, first, the Obama administration attempted to be very aggressive through the agencies and were stymied in court. Boyden, of course, was at the forefront. Part of why he's founded his law firm was to sue the Obama administration for precisely this sort of overreach. Funny how things all tie together. Ted Cruz had a very persuasive speech a while back in a white paper that chronicled these losses, mostly before the D.C. Circuit and even before the Supreme Court, sometimes 9-0. These losses led really directly to the dust-up in the Senate over the application of the filibuster to judicial appointments. And if you dig back into the details, the removal of the filibuster was tied directly to efforts to replenish the D.C. Circuit, with judges much more aligned with that administration's regulatory efforts. After that, they did get some wins and it got some attention. But separate and apart from that, over time, it became harder and harder not to notice the ever-growing and ever more powerful federal bureaucracy. Certainly, the older, what I'll call the traditional agencies had grown, but the more recent creations had really come into the fore. The so-called independent agencies, independent of what, we're still not quite sure, but the independent agencies, many of which were born of the 1970s mega bills, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Title IX, Federal Election Campaign Act, and others becoming more and more dominant and far-reaching in American life. They're all cut from the same mold. Some sort of bipartisan composition, usually an odd number, with a powerful chairman, staggered terms that extend beyond any four-year presidential term, some sort of removal protection, loads of permanent staff, usually an outsized general counsel, who also may be appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, some sort of subpoena and investigatory power, monetary penalties, referral power to DOJ, and an enabling statute that, to be kind, is kind of broad, kind of loose, and kind of unconstitutional. I know the type because I ran one of these agencies, the Federal Election Commission, and I experienced firsthand the reality of these agencies. Multi-headed, supposedly bipartisan, commissioners insulated from removal by the president, whether explicitly or through practice. Some agencies do not have removal protection, but the Senate has worked out sort of deals where you really don't take out the other team's people. Staggered terms so as to outlast any administration. Career staff think they run the place. And in agencies like the SEC and the FTC, administrative law judges who rule today, themselves isolated from oversight or removal, all with a broad grant of statutory power to, paraphrasing here, make the world a better place so Congress could declare the problem solved and move on to the next issue. It was the 1970s, after all. There was a new generation in Congress, a massive wave of younger members, naders, raiders, activists, campus do-gooders, all seemed to get elected to Congress at the same time. The easiest way to quickly claim solutions is to create an agency, announce the problem solved, and leave it to the bureaucracy to figure it out. This also had the convenient benefit of political deniability. If an agency did not do things correctly, it wasn't Congress's fault. When you combine this sort of approach to governing with the hubris of the unelected agency folk, and these agencies were populated with the same sort of generational activists. The FEC, for example, was populated with Naderites, and the folks who investigated and audited the Nixon campaign became the FEC's audit division. And with courts deferring to all sorts of agency decisions, big and small, it ought not be surprising that it all got carried away. But still, many just took for granted deference doctrines, nearly limitless delegations of power, the overbearing system of ALJs, and other excesses of the administrative state. And so back in the days before I was White House counsel, I still often found myself shouting into the wind about bedrock administrative law principles, and not the sort of administrative law that was taught in schools, with all due respect. Look, coming up with wild hypos under the APA and becoming the master of its details is certainly a valuable skill. That's all well and good and necessary. But what I am talking about here is sort of the things Boyden talked about, the much larger structural issues that sound in constitutionality, mandated separation of powers, due process, federalism, and the like. And in the constitutional law classrooms, this was not really taught either. Sure, there was that one day where we spent half a day on some Rehnquist dissents talking about non-delegation, but that always ended with the professor's eye roll, head shake, while muttering through a smirk about Schechter poultry. Ha. Thank you. Okay. We have more important things to learn: how to get Justice Powell's vote, and how to guess what side of the bed Harry Blackmun got up on. Poor Joshua. Not long ago, I would have to patiently explain the basics to associates, and maybe not so patiently to folks at the Federal Election Commission, many of whom had taken sort of new experimental 1L intro to administrative law classes, or even so had clerked for some fancy judges. It wasn't good enough to find something in a regulation, but they must also read the statute in the course of understanding applicable law. Can the regulation really reach that conduct, I would ask? The statute does not go that far. How can the reg? Or how, the basic algebra, right? But some folks didn't get it. Or how to bolster the defense of clients by driving a wedge between agency action and the authorizing statute. The list goes on. The Federal Election Commission had a saying, which was counterintuitive: the statute is our friend. If you actually read the statute, you realize the jurisdiction is much more narrow than the career folks think so. What agencies have done is build up what I call the common law of the bureaucracy. Some regs, a bunch of enforcement matters, maybe a few successful lawsuits, years and years of advisory opinions, a whole stack of sub-regulatory guidance, most of which is not even public, frequently asked questions on their website. In the mind of the bureaucracy, that's the way things are done. Rarely, if ever, is a statute referenced or consulted. And now, as we start to dig through in the post-Loper-Bright lens, we see rulemakings that basically concede the regulation goes beyond the statute and citing the Chevron deference. That is correct. There's explanations and justifications of regulations in federal agencies that explicitly cite Chevron. Yet tell me a single agency who has announced any sort of initiative to review its regulations for such illegality in the post-Loper-Bright world. I think the answer is question and answer. Maybe somebody can correct me. If someone knows, it's probably going to be Naomi. But my sense is no one has bothered. But I digress. Going back some years, how we got here, things started to change a bit in the last few years of President Obama. Recall the House flipped and policy was not going to be accomplished via legislation. But really, it was the plight of the Sacketts, the beleaguered targets of the EPA's waters of the U.S. interpretation, who have since been vindicated 9-0 at the Supreme Court 15 years after their fight began. As an aside, recall that the courts first told the Sacketts that they, in fact, had no recourse under the Administrative Procedures Act before the court reversed the Ninth Circuit in 2012. Been a long time. Then it picked up steam a bit more as Obama really started testing his pen and phone powers late in his second term. People were beginning to see the behemoth for what it was, not just a plus-up of costs for industry, but a threat to individual liberty and constitutional order. Let me pause on that for a moment. It still remains fashionable in certain circles to put all the eggs in the cost-benefit or benefit-cost analysis bucket. In other words, if we just make agencies explain the cost of regulation, that will solve the problem. Certainly, it helps. Congress often talks in these terms. You saw this in the second part of the Trump administration. Lots of economic talk out of OMB. But there is more to it. Overregulation is a threat to individual liberty in and of itself. It is a threat to the constitutional order in and of itself. Simply because one cannot produce an expert witness with a color pie chart does not make a regulation sound or a good idea or within the reach of a statute or consistent with the Constitution. What we are seeing also is more exposure to what I call the moves of government. I had witnessed firsthand at the FEC and in private practice, government lawyers who could adopt arguments and positions in order to avoid judicial review. They could find shortcuts like Chevron deference, engineer nearly automatic wins, or otherwise leave ordinary Americans without true recourse against the whims of the executive branch. Litigation against agencies rarely reached the merits. The government had 50 pages of briefing first, standing, not final agency action, Chevron deference. The list goes on and on of all the things government would throw up if one were trying to vindicate your ability to do things free of unnecessary interference. Then 2016 happens, and I saw an opportunity, hoping to bring something to what was always going to be a limited time as White House counsel. The fact that Boyden served as counsel to the president for 4 years really is unprecedented. The fact he was there for 8 years before as counsel to the vice president is crazy. I don't know how you could possibly do it. And as rough as my tenure was, I still am one of the longer serving White House counsels. People, Reg is not like you'd think. I would keep track. I called Bob Bauer one day and say, Bob, I beat you by a day. He said, really? You've been there that long? I said, yeah, it doesn't feel like it. But yeah, it feels like it to me. Take on the administrative state from the White House itself. I spent quite a bit of time with Boyden on this, learning how he did things and learning how much he drove the regulatory policy apparatus from the White House. So he was the role model of how to do the job. When I spoke of regulatory reform, at least back then and even now, I did not mean the sort of industry lobbying, cost-cutting measures you may first think of. Detailed fixes to carve out this, that, or the other was not really what we had in mind. I mean reforming the regulatory state in an attempt to realign it with foundational principles to the extent that's possible. So the White House counsel's office dedicated itself to finding ways to reassert due process and fundamental fairness in the government, watching both policymaking and enforcement procedure, rein in sub-regulatory guidance, increase transparency, bring an end to secret law. Agencies have a ton of memos, that most of which are not public, hence they're secret, that actually instruct their career staff how to implement what they claim to be the law, and reinsert fidelity to statutory authority and order, all while prioritizing appointments and staffing with proper orientation on administrative law matters. After all, personnel is policy. This is sort of my paraphrase of Boyden's main message to me. I tried to capture it in one paragraph. We tried to break the usual mold and to return back to what I saw happen in the Reagan years and the first Bush administration. And the usual mold, we also tried to break the mold with personnel. And this is something that I also stole from Boyden. Typically, when you staff out agency heads, you put a lawyer in charge, and usually they pass a bunch of big regulations after announcing that they found a problem. They do a bunch of press releases. Outside sort of interest groups give them awards, and then they launch a bunch of enforcement cases, rack up a bunch of penalties. They get a bunch of awards for being the new sheriff in town, a bunch of press releases, and then they quit. And then they go to a big law firm, and then they go to corporate America, and they say, man, there's all these new regulations and all these big penalties. I'm the only guy that can really get you through this. And I would tell people when they would come into the office, if that's what you want to be, you're in the wrong office. It's not what we want. And this was actually something that, I kind of have my own way of saying it. But another thing I kind of stole from Boyden is watch who you put in charge of these places. I was asked to give the Barbara Olson lecture at the Federalist Society Convention in 2017, and there I emphasized the greatest threat to the rule of law in our modern society is the ever-expanding regulatory state, and the most effective bulwark against that threat is a strong judiciary. After that speech, Boyden ran into me in the hall, and he said he really enjoyed my comments. I didn't say what part, because I knew he was there. Everything we tried to do was actually hidden in plain view. The media really didn't follow it at all, not surprisingly, because the Twitter account kept sort of the attention up here somewhere. But I meant it when I said it, and even bigger and more lasting than executive branch management was the flip side of, I think, the same coin: judicial appointments and the opportunity to strengthen the safeguards of law through the judiciary. Look at Neil Gorsuch, the administrative law master, and certainly a true believer in the dangers of a runaway bureaucracy. Then Judge Gorsuch had recently penned a 10th Circuit concurrence in a case called Gutierrez-Brizuela, which explored in detail the harms of Chevron deference to ordinary people in America and captured our attention in the vetting process. He wrote, and I quote, "The fact is Chevron and Brand X," I like how he gives Brand X a little elbow walking by there. "The fact is Chevron and Brand X permit executive bureaucracies to swallow huge amounts of core judicial and legislative power and concentrate federal power in a way that seems more than a little difficult to square with the Constitution of the framers' design. Maybe the time has come to face the behemoth." Now, after Loper Bright, this aspect of the behemoth, we hope, has been vanquished. 18 months later, Brett Kavanaugh, the executive branch veteran and D.C. Circuit standout, and the one who handed the Obama administration quite a few losses, was also nominated to the court. In the same vein, I'll note that then Judge Kavanaugh had penned a key D.C. Circuit dissent in the net neutrality case that articulated that given the vast economic impact such a regulation would have and Congress's relative silence on the issue in the statute, the scope of the agency authority must be limited. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should. That was a D.C. Circuit dissent then. It's now become the law of the land in form of the major questions doctrine after West Virginia versus EPA. I also have to mention there's a new generation of federal judges since appointed who brought a commitment not to deciding certain issues certain ways, but who exhibited courage and fidelity to constitutional order and the rule of law. And these, of course, are the circuit judges. This didn't happen overnight, just like the rise of an overzealous administrative state did not happen overnight. These shifts in doctrine happened over time. When a new justice is appointed, he or she cannot simply issue a press release stating which cases he thinks or she thinks are now overruled. Some people seem confused by this. So they think when a new justice is appointed, the world is going to end. They build over time. And this court, I think, has really demonstrated its commitment to the constitutional separation of powers by requiring the executive branch to be faithful to the statute. I'll skip all that. If you look at what the media calls the big policy opinions of the Supreme Court during the last 5 years or so, the vaccine mandate, the student loan cases, the eviction moratorium, Clean Power Plan, WOTUS, challenges often, quote unquote, won on the grounds that the president and his administration did not have the power to do what they were attempting to do. Even matters that seem different are really part of the unified whole. I'm thinking about the presidential immunity decision here, which peeled back the matter to its core issue and framed it up much more along the lines of constitutional structural first principles. And perhaps just as importantly, people who have been wronged by the government in various ways, particularly by administrative agencies, now have a host of expressly recognized and articulated ways to fight back in a more equal and constitutional playing field than they have had in generations. This was not, essentially Boyden's ideas and musings out loud had become the law of the land. So when the government demands that you not only have inspectors on your fishing boat, but you have to pay for those government inspectors, all without anything of the sort appearing in the statute, you now at least have a chance to say no. So the current Supreme Court, well, this court, I think, is starting to ask questions that had not been asked routinely in the past. They asked, does the agency have the power to take the challenged action? Was there a clear delegation of authority in the case of a major question? Alabama Association of Realtors, for example, West Virginia versus EPA. Did the agency use the best reading of the statute to determine the limits of their authority? Biden versus Nebraska, it's a student loan case. Loper Bright, I mentioned Garland versus Cargill, that's regarding bump stocks. Is the agency properly constituted and the decision maker properly appointed under the Constitution, seal of law, is a seminal case now on that. Did the agency provide the accused with the Seventh Amendment rights? It's kind of a sleeper case this term over ALJs. And all of this builds on the courts ensuring access to federal courts. Sackett 1, which is, of course, 2012, Axon from 2023, that structural challenges may go directly to the court. Agencies would always throw up these roadblocks and prevent people from going to court. And of course, corner post versus Federal Reserve, when the APA statute of limitations runs, it runs from the injury, not the government action. But if you read the news and listen to the TV crowd, this must all be a happy accident. No, it is not. This was all planned, and it began long before I arrived on the scene. This is not to say that who is the president doesn't matter, but the reality is the executive branch agency reforms under one president can be, and most of the time were largely undone by the stroke of a pen at the beginning of the next administration. But judicial appointments are as close as we can say to forever. Oldham, Bumate, Richardson, Albandian, Thapar, Katsas, Menashe, Murphy, Rao, Branch, Mady, Brennan, the list goes on and on. What makes these newer generations of judges different? Well, they're not all that different from some of the older generation. I'm thinking of the Reagan appointees to the D.C. Circuit, but now we've taken that idea and spread it out throughout the country. They certainly take administrative law seriously, and by administrative law, I mean more the structural fundamentals of our government seriously. And they view government power with skepticism. Take Andy Oldham, for example. Louisiana versus the Department of Energy, commonly called the dishwasher case. It is quite the tour de force over something seemingly not that important, but it's really worth a read on how he sort of boldly takes apart the agency's work on continuing to move the goalpost on how much water one needs in dishwashers, noting that under sort of the current view from the agency, the dishwashers cannot actually wash dishes, but they save water. They certainly understand and address the moves of the government. They're skeptical of the government in profound ways, not just actions, but in the way the government actually pursues its goals. Andy Oldham, again, the White Line case, the FDA's flip-flopping all over the place on e-cigarettes. He, writing for the en banc court, begins, quote, over several years, the Food and Drug Administration sent manufacturers of flavored e-cigarette products on a wild goose chase, unquote. Now, let me be clear here. This isn't the first line of a throwaway concurrence. This is the first line of an en banc majority from a circuit court. You really didn't quite see this prose all that often in the past. So there's certainly more strident. Patrick Bumate is another one that has quite a bit of body of work. I'd read California Restaurant Association versus City of Berkeley. This concerned Berkeley's ban on gas lines into restaurants for appliances. He wrote that federal law expressly preempts state and local regulations concerning the energy use of many natural gas appliances, including those used in household and restaurant kitchens. Instead of directly banning those appliances in new buildings, Berkeley took a more circuitous route to the same result. It enacted a building code that prohibits natural gas piping into those buildings, rendering the gas appliances useless. They have in common that they really have something for appliances and kitchens. But in the earlier panel, the example of California running the show nationally, here's an example of a judge kind of the sort that is a logical conclusion of Boyden's work, who's actually making good on that sort of thinking. There's Judge John Albandian. It's a dissent on the non-delegation doctrine. He said, quote, for 88 years, federal courts have tiptoed around the idea that an act of Congress could be invalidated as an unconstitutional delegation of legislative power. The majority continues this trend, but in my view, that streak should end today. Again, Boyden's idea now being crafted by someone of a different generation wearing a black robe. So looking forward, what is next? Well, what the body politic does in our elections is well beyond the scope of why we are assembled today, and for tax purposes and other reasons, I certainly will not get anywhere near that topic. So let's talk to maybe a future generation of selecting judges. Lessons learned, I think, over the past generations. When you're looking for Supreme Court material, simply being conservative is not enough. A judicial track record, I think, is key. Not to sort of throw some shade, but if you look at the 2020 Supreme Court list that the president put out at that time, certainly they were all conservative. Very few were judges. There was no track record And how could you put out a list that doesn't include Oldham, Branch, Richardson, Menashe, Bumate, Nalbandian, and those sorts of judges of that caliber? There's certainly some other up-and-comers to watch. I do this sort of as a hobby. What may happen next time. Someday, Cat Mizell down in Florida, Eileen Cannon in Florida, Judge Beaton on the Western District of Kentucky, Trevor McFadden in D.C., Michael Liberti, District Court of Arizona, Evan Youngs on the Texas Supreme Court now, Kevin Brobson on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, Clint Bollock on the Arizona Supreme Court, Judge Wyrick is still out in Oklahoma. There's a whole nother generation potentially coming, all sort of schooled in the same, we'll call it the Boyden worldview. But the Supreme Court is certainly a completely different ballgame. It's not good enough to act like a lower court judge as a justice. The court's job is to take cases to decide the great legal issues of our time, and so a justice must be decisive at all points in the process, not just on the merits, but procedurally. Once on the Supreme Court, there is no longer the need to try to ace your Civ Pro exam or win the amateur in Fed courts. The court is created by the Constitution itself. There's a certain kind of courage. That's the courage to use the power you have to do the job you've been given. Justices must have a sense of emerging issues and tackle those problems head on, not just explain that they are hard or thorny problems. My head hurt, can't we do this tomorrow is not okay. Saying the lower courts will figure it out tomorrow is also not okay. Certainly, they ought not find reasons not to decide things today and punt them to later. And while judicial restraint is often to be commended, not to write so narrowly or worse, so equivocally to create a bigger knot to untangle for the next time. This includes full merits cases, but especially those that reach the court on the so-called emergency docket, which is often key to stopping illegal federal government action in its tracks before taking hold and being too late. What I would say that the Supreme Court have asked is it okay that the SAC has dealt with the problem for 15 years? Is that okay? I think not. And justices must not be duped by the government playing its games in order to avoid bad outcomes, even when those outcomes are correct under existing law or the Constitution. Take a look at the briefs in Kaiser and Loper-Bright. The sky will fall, it's too big to fail, you can't overrule precedent because there's been too much reliance, blah, blah, blah. Compare that with a recent brief in Consumers Research versus CPSC, where it's actually my case, for seeking cert out of the Fifth Circuit. The government says, don't take cert, it's too small an issue, not a big deal, save it for the big stuff. Okay, Goldilocks, which is it? One day it's too big, the next day it's too small. So the court is doing a pretty good job at seeing through most of this stuff. Hopefully they see through it in the Fifth Circuit cert petition and realize you have the power to fix it. So I think in this sense, having either served in the highest levels of the executive branch, the legislative branch, or tussled with the government is key. And when one looks back to sort of the all-stars of the D.C. Circuit, they all came out of a significant tenure of working in and around the government. And I think that's part of the key to why that sort of thinking really works. But to go back full circle, and I may certainly have my own biases, but the same experiences in the government that led to my lifelong skepticism of administrative power, and my quote from the Federalist Society speech about what's the greatest threat to our rule of law in modern society, is really the same sort of thing that I think is also common among the judges that we look to be thought leaders in this issue. So I'll wrap up by looking ahead. What is it going to take to continue this momentum first? And I wrote this before I heard the last panel, so I'm not stealing this. But Congress must stand strong and do its job now that Loper-Bright has re-empowered it. No more fake legislative deals, just kicking it to an agency. They have no one to blame but themselves. Second, it would be helpful if America had a break from an overzealous executive branch that bypassed Congress and does the democratic process in order to achieve policy goals. Maybe every other Tuesday we'll just take off and have a bipartisan detente that the executive branch will just sort of relax and not try to do too much. Third, do you see a pattern here? The Supreme Court needs to do its job, especially while there seems to be a pretty good consensus on most of the issues that matter. It's certainly not a legislature, and I don't mean to suggest it, but where I come from, when you have the votes, call the vote. Don't wait. The biggest question at the court right now does not seem to be about the merits, but about who is willing to take on and actually decide the big issues. It's been a common complaint the court does not take enough cases. It seems there might be some confusion sometimes about the importance of taking and deciding cases. especially certain types of them involving the government, especially as issues are emerging. You can't phone it in at the cert stage and say, I'll figure it out at the merits. It's becoming more and more apparent that cert becomes almost a proxy for what the merits are going to look like. They've had some hiccups. The case concerning the Remain in Mexico policy, Biden versus Texas, some voting issues, other cases that are more urgent than probably it seems to be at the court. And they tend to sort of focus occasionally on process more than the merits when time sometimes does matter. The Supreme Court, I think, needs to start remembering it's different. It's not a creature of statute or convenience or logistics. It can't become passive for procedural or other reasons. In short, when the government is acting unlawfully, the Supreme Court must continue to stop it. If it wants to maintain what it said in Marbury, it must rise to the challenge and say what the law is and not avoid saying what the law is. On the other side, good lawyers must continue to find and bring good, solid, meritorious cases on the most important issues to the court. Briefs need to be written to convince this court, these justices, and not just one or two justices, but a majority of the justices, using arguments that will resonate with who is there today. We must continue to bolster these wins and find the best ways to continue fighting for individual liberty through administrative law doctrine. Most of the supposed cutting-edge issues are really subsets of this approach. Think about the contraceptive mandate. Sure, lots of public policy rhetoric, lots of disagreement, but at the end of the day, that was not in the statute. It was a complete creation of the bureaucracy. Think about the parties harmed, whether they be states through their AGs or private parties in enforcement matters. They must continue to expansively and vigorously defend themselves from federal government overreach using all tools available. This is not as easy as it sounds. Heavily regulated industries cannot simply say no willy-nilly. There are too many lawyers and moving parts and layers and embedded regulators within companies to simply hand out copies of Loper Bright and say, see? Finally, I believe that some of the most successful new battles will arise from the enforcement side. These are tough cases to find. Oftentimes, enforcement cases are confidential. You don't know about them until it's too late, but they tend to tell a much better tale of woe than sort of a preemptive strike, particularly, it seems, with this Supreme Court. Since Chief has become the chief, we see many things on facial challenges get sort of okayed, but then on the as applied, they really kind of take it apart. So you need to have patience and see how things play out. If you'd asked me 10 years ago or so, coming when I left the FEC, where we would be, I certainly wouldn't have predicted where we are now with all the twists and turns. Certainly not having seen this particular Supreme Court do so much. But what gives me good hope to continue is that there is a next generation of folks already on the bench, both federal and state court, who are carrying on the sort of thought leadership that Boyden started. And I want to, again, conclude by thanking you for the invite, allowing me to be here. It's an honor to kind of stand anywhere near something that says Boyden Gray, because I'm just sort of a rip-off version of what Boyden truly was. So thank you. I appreciate your attention.
Thanks, Don. And thanks one more time to everybody for joining us, all of our speakers, but most of all of our guests for joining us. I hope you'll join us in the reception in the next room. And thanks again for joining us today.